The merits of globalization have come under scrutiny. Countries across the globe have adopted what The Economist has coined homeland economics. The purpose of this presentation is to investigate the cost and benefits of government industrialized subsidies of large swaths of the economy and to determine, is this intelligent policy or will it be folly and an inefficient endeavor? At the end of World War II, the world was broadly divided into Western democracies who supported free market capitalism and the Eastern Bloc countries which came under the control of the Soviet Union and Central Planned Communism. In December 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapsed. This led to the 1990s and globalization. In the 1990s, globalization took off. Governments loosened controls on travel, investment, and trade. China acceded to the WTO, or World Trade Organization, which turbocharged trade between Asia and the West. The positive changes of globalization included the benefits of reduced poverty and inequality and growing political freedom. These charts provided by The Economist demonstrate the economic marvel of what is globalization. The first chart measures the percentage of people living on less than $2.15 per day. You can see that from 1990 through almost 2020, that percentage fell from almost 40% to less than 10%. The second chart, income of highest earning 10% as a multiple of the bottom 50%, basically a measure of income inequality. Income inequality also fell drastically with the onset of globalization. And then finally, this idea of political freedom, mostly with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the many Eastern Bloc countries living under the iron thumb of Stalin and his successors, but also political freedom with economic globalization of other countries such as Vietnam, that the number of people living under autocratic rule or closed autocracies also fell. So these charts demonstrate the ideas presented in the previous slide of reduced poverty, reduced inequality, and growing political freedom. The remainder of this presentation will investigate the age-old economic question, how much government control of the economy? As represented on this chart here, the two economic systems. On the right, laissez-faire market-based capitalism, private ownership of economic resources. On the left, central planned communism, aka socialism, government control of land, capital, and labor. Theoretically, the United States has been an adopter of market capitalism, so have other Western democracies. The question of this homeland economics is, how efficient is it to turn over the reins of more government control, industrialization of certain sectors of the economy? We will investigate the cost and benefits of this policy. Governments, especially leaders of modern economies, are abandoning globalization in favor of this radical alternative, homeland economics. Government planned industrial production on a massive scale, centrally planned subsidies for green energy, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and any other industries deemed important to national security. The rationale for homeland economics: reduce economic risks in three specific areas. One, the idea of market volatility. Second, the unpredictable shocks such as what happened during the pandemic, and dealing with unforeseen geopolitical opponents and events. More about that in a moment. Supporters of homeland economics truly believe that it will produce a safer, more fair, greener planet. The Economist argues, however, that adopting these large industrialized government subsidies will actually have the opposite effect. Homeland economics developed in response to four big shocks. These shocks are not mutually exclusive. First, economic calamities. The 2007 financial crisis, Brokerage firms' overexposure to derivative instruments almost brought down the entire global economic system, leading many to question the merits of market capitalism. The 2020 pandemic, an unforeseen, unpredictable economic calamity, led many to question the resiliency of global supply chains and the intelligence of being reliant on China for certain goods. Second, geopolitical risks. The two largest economies, the United States and China, currently geopolitical adversaries and have a tenuous relationship. Over the past 2 years, two other geopolitical events, specifically military conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and the current military engagement between Hamas and Israel, these type of geopolitical events are worrisome for modern economies. Energy economics. A few ideas here. First, the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner, greener energy, and then the idea of countries being exposed to geopolitical risks associated with purchasing energy resources from an adversary. The obvious example, what happened with Europe and their overexposure to Russia for natural gas. Last, definitely not least, generative AI. This has both an economic aspect from the standpoint that countries want to be first to develop and implement artificial intelligence into their economic systems, but also the idea of security and military risks associated with making certain countries are on the cutting edge with this advancing technology. What exactly is the plan to implement homeland economics? Homeland economics aims to protect the world from similar future shocks. Homeland economics seeks to keep the benefits of globalization efficiency and lower prices, but avoid the downsides of uncertainty and unfairness of the previous system. Accomplishing this dual mandate of homeland economics requires meshing national security and economic policy. Politicians, geopolitical strategists, and global leaders tout the benefits of homeland economics. Strategies to implement homeland economics include 1930s-style tariffs and 1950s-style government-funded research labs, similar to what took place during the Cold War, championing certain strategic industries. This time around, those industries would include computer chips, EVs, artificial intelligence, and green energy. So huge subsidies for domestic production, encouraging home production. Western governments using economic tools to weaken geopolitical adversaries, including bans on exports and internal investment, which involve dual-use technologies for civilian and military applications. Significant subsidies for clean technologies to fight climate change. Examples of homeland economics can be found right here in our homeland, the USA, such as the Biden CHIPS Act, the semiconductor industry, and the Inflationary Reduction Act, which does anything but reduce inflation. Right? Government-funded economic activity with the goal of increasing domestic employment and domestic technological expertise. What's good or possibly bad for the goose is good for the other geese, or gander, or ever how that saying goes. But this is a sardonic title to this slide, Globalization of Homeland Economics. In essence, the United States may be the leader, but all other countries are adopting similar measures of subsidizing green energy and semiconductors, similar industries. We see these campaigns popping up everywhere. Made in China, made in America, made in Europe, made in India, made in Canada, made in Australia, etc., etc. Again, thanking The Economist for this data. The first chart up top tracks from 2010 through 2022 global industrial policy interventions. So research tracking industrial policy interventions over time and quantifying recent trends. Two ideas are important here. First, in the past, poor countries used industrial policy as a developmental tool to catch up. And then the second observation, the obvious surge in 2021, 2022, now the lion's share of industrial policies and modern industrial are modern industrial economies adopting homeland economic subsidies. Right? The second chart down bottom is simply an industrial policy ideas expressed in party manifestos, percentage of total phrases. In other words, how much are politicians using these phrases in their campaigns and slogans. With the rise of populist politicians, hey, who was the first one to use Made in America? Our buddy Donald Trump. Follow the money, an accurate and intelligent economic idiom. Right? Econ 101, incentives matter. With a 40% increase in subsidies in the industries of artificial intelligence, computer chips, and green energies, corporations have shifted production to align themselves to receive some of this free economic candy, moving facilities geographically or expanding offerings in those three areas. Second idea here, corporate response to political ideologies. Terms that have been heard lately at corporate boardroom meetings and corporate publications, reshoring. The idea of bringing production back to the good old US of A. Then the adjustment in inventory approach, as opposed to the efficient pre-pandemic approach of just-in-time inventory, having just enough inventory and raw materials to meet production needs. Just-in-case inventory is the idea of keeping high stocks of raw materials and finished goods as a safety net against supply chain failures. Another idea with this corporate response is businesses leaving China altogether. Finally, investors have taken notice. The share prices of American firms which are perceived to benefit from these large subsidies, their shares on average have risen 13% over the previous period as opposed to a 9% decline in the overall stock market. Employing the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model of macroeconomic equilibrium, we can evaluate the proposed economic effects of homeland economics, subsidizing green energy, artificial intelligence, and the computer chip industry, aka semiconductors. Assuming the economy is at full employment equilibrium output, Q1, P1, growing at about 2.5% real GDP, unemployment somewhere in the neighborhood of 4%, and inflation at about 2%, aggregate price level exactly where we desire it to be. A large increase in government subsidies will shift the aggregate supply curve to right. Theoretically, an increase in aggregate supply, a rightward shift of aggregate supply, creates non-inflationary economic growth. As the economy grows from Q1 level of output to Q2 level of output, we have an increase in real GDP. An increase in output provides or offers more job opportunities, so better employment opportunities for working Americans with non-inflationary pressures. The proposed benefits of homeland economics sound reasonable, making supply chains more resilient, economic assistance for geographic regions left behind and the individuals living in those areas, rebuilding America's energy structure and systems around renewable, clean energy, which avoid the pollution issues of fossil fuels, and finally standing up to China. What could possibly go wrong? The economist questions the alleged benefits of homeland economics. First, the economist argues that any proposed benefits would flow to the wrong parties, specifically the bosses of the firms receiving payouts, investors who own these firms, and local areas who stand to benefit from new factory construction. The economist argues there could be billions of losers to homeland economics for three reasons. Number one, it's an overly pessimistic interpretation of neoliberal globalization, which lifted millions out of poverty and reduced income inequality across the globe. Second, the economist argues there are limited benefits of separating from China. And third, the economist points out any proposed benefits of green subsidies to fight climate change are much more ambiguous than the proponents of these programs would readily admit. The Economist offers measurable cost of homeland economics if adopted. First, the IMF, or International Monetary Fund, argues that there could be reduction in global output in the short run of 1% from splitting the world into China and America blocks, and 2% decrease in real GDP in the long run. Other estimates consider the IMF numbers to be too conservative, predicting a 5% decline in real GDP on a global scale connected with separating the world into two blocks, China and the United States, or China and Western democracies. Second, the historical evidence or experience of industrial policy is not altogether encouraging, with many instances of government waste, huge opportunity cost of inefficient spending which could be used otherwise to alleviate poverty, pay for pension programs, pay for health care, and reduce blossoming deficits which have already demonstrated to be well above historical norms. The Economist argues homeland economics will fail to make supply chains more resilient, will not help domestic economies, and will do little to reduce income inequality and not enough to deal with climate change. However, it's difficult to convince voters of the benefits of market economics. Governments boast the success of subsidy regimes, making the damage of lower income and less efficiency, which are harder to see and easy to ignore. What will happen 10 years into the future? It's difficult to predict. However, economies are storing up trouble. The West will probably be still as reliant on China as it was a decade from now, and it's highly likely that politicians will double down on centrally planned industrialization, arguing the minor successes outweigh the major costs.